Today's video is the first episode of my solo PUBG beginner tips video series. I've played PUBG on console for almost 2.5 years now, and the main goal of this beginner tips series is to help the newer players out with the types of things that I would want to have known when I first started playing PUBG 2.5 years ago. If you've been playing for a while and you're more at the intermediate or advanced stage of PUBG, I would still recommend watching this video because there might be some fundamental things that you can apply into your gameplay. But without further ado, let's get stuck into the tips. The first tip that I've got is about choosing where to drop. A lot of tips videos that you might have seen in the past pretty much just say drop at the hot compounds so that you can get used to gunfights. I disagree with this tactic. As a beginner player, what I would recommend is using training mode or team deathmatch to practice your gunplay. When you drop into a live solo lobby, I would recommend dropping at smaller compounds or the less populated larger compounds, especially if they are further away from the flight path. What you're trying to achieve here is finding a little bit of early game combat while aiming to avoid the more experienced players. This isn't going to work every time, but from my experience, it's better to fight early and lose than spend half of the game looting up just to be killed before you get to fire around. For each of the maps, I've decided to highlight the areas that I would recommend dropping if you're a beginner or even an intermediate player in PUBG solos. For Erangel, you can see that the places I would recommend are the shooting range, Gatka, this little compound that I like to call Poor Man's Pachinki, Mansion, Lopovka, and Ferry Pier. The places to definitely avoid are school and school apartments, Pachinki, Georgia Pool, and military base, as these areas are very populated and often swarming with the highest skilled players. On Vikendi, there's so many compounds that you really have a lot of options, but the places that I would avoid are Villa, Goroka, Castle, Podvosto, Dino Land, and Coal Mine. If you're playing on Sanhok, please do not drop at the boot camp, as this is essentially a place that experienced players go to have an intense battle before the actual game begins. Other places to avoid are Ruins, Paradise, and Painan. Keep in mind that on Sanhok, there is so much loot everywhere that you can pretty much just fly somewhere away from the flight path and land at a larger compound, where you're likely going to get one or two opponents who are hopefully not going to be quite as skilled or confident. If you're playing on Miramar, avoid Picado, Hacienda, Power Grid, San Martin, and Los Leones. I've highlighted some of the areas that I would recommend dropping in Miramar. And if you're playing on Karakin, pretty much just avoid the large compounds. There's plenty of loot at the smaller areas around the map. And for a solo player, the larger compounds are really overkill, so there's really no need to drop there. So long story short, if you're dropping in solos as a beginner in PUBG, avoid the super populated common drop areas, but aim to find a compound where you're likely to come into some early game combat. So now you've decided where you want to drop. The next most important thing is getting to the ground as quickly as possible. This will give you the best opportunity to loot up and fight your enemies before they get the drop on you. If you're dropping into Sanhok, the fastest way to get to the ground is to drop roughly 1,000 to 1,100 meters away from your destination. You then want to descend at roughly 170 to 175 kilometers per hour, while leaving enough altitude that you can descend quickly at the end of your flight, and ideally reach the maximum dropping speed of 234 kilometers per hour. If you're dropping into the larger maps like Erangel, Vikendi, or Miramar, you want to try and exit the plane a little bit earlier, around 800 to 900 meters away from your destination, and descend a little bit faster at around about 195 to 200 kilometers per hour, while again leaving that little bit of altitude that you can descend quickly at the end of your drop. Parachuting into Karakin for me has proved pretty inconsistent and messy, and I really feel like the distance that you drop from isn't as important or significant. Next up, we're talking about which weapons you should use as a beginner player in PUBG. The main things to consider here is that you want to be well covered in combat situations at all the different ranges, be that close range, mid-range, and long-range battles. To accomplish this, I would recommend your primary weapon being an assault rifle or an SMG with a red dot, a hollow sight, or a 2x scope. And generally, this should be accompanied by a DMR or a sniper rifle with a 4, 6, or 8x scope. My recommendation for a beginner player is that a DMR is actually a better option in this case, because they're more forgiving and you get a chance to shoot more rounds at your enemies, rather than the bolt action type rifles. So look into weapons like the Mini 14, the SKS, and the SLR. The primary assault rifles and SMGs that I would recommend are the M416, the QBZ, the SCAR-L, and in regards to SMGs, mainly the PP Bison or the Vector, provided that you've got an extended mag. These weapons are generally easier to control in regards to recoil, and especially if you have a compensator, a vertical grip, and a tactical stock for those weapons that can hold it. Although using sidearms can be quite fun, I really wouldn't recommend holding a sidearm on which you can equip a red dot sight. Mainly because when you're in the heat of battle and trying to equip a red dot sight onto your assault rifle, sometimes it will accidentally equip onto your pistol, which is not what you want, especially if you're being pushed by an opponent. Next up, we're talking about PUBG inventory. An even balance of items in your bag will ensure that you're well equipped for any situation in PUBG. Also remember that the amount that you can carry significantly changes depending on the level of your bag. So try not to hold on to a level 1 bag for too long. Generally, I would recommend holding 3 to 5 first aids, 5 bandages, 3 to 5 boosters, that is energy drinks, painkillers, and adrenaline syringes. Don't underestimate the power of throwables. Currently, Molotovs are potentially the best throwable that you can hold, but in general I would be holding between 3 to 5 throwables, including 1 or 2 smoke grenades, to get you out of sticky situations. In regards to ammo, at least 150 rounds in reserve is recommended for a beginner player, and if you're running 9mm ammo, that being Vectors, Micro Uzis, the VSS, or the PP Bison, then I'd recommend holding even more than this, maybe between 200 or 250 rounds in reserve, as this ammo does less damage and the fire rate of these weapons is often faster, meaning that you tend to go through rounds pretty quickly. What you'll find is that the more experienced that you become playing PUBG, the less extra rounds you need to carry, because you can tend to rely on picking up ammo from the opponents that you kill. Personally, if I have between 80 to 100 rounds in reserve, I'm pretty happy. And this also allows for me to carry more throwables and more medical supplies. And finally, on inventory, it's a good idea to jump into the training mode and get familiar with which attachments are compatible with your favorite weapons. That way you can begin to collect these attachments in anticipation of finding that dream weapon. So that's the first episode of my PUBG beginner tips series. Hopefully you guys found it useful. If you did, make sure that you like this video and let me know in the comments section, so that way I know that everyone's interested to see the second and third episodes for this series. But anyway guys, thanks for watching. If you haven't already, make sure that you stop by my Twitch stream and say hello. I'd love to hear from you. But until next time, have a good one.